The story of Tsutomu Yamaguchi does not begin with fire. It begins with the kind of morning that should have passed unnoticed, a routine work trip in the final summer of World War II, when the sky over Hiroshima glowed a soft, ordinary blue and cicadas droned like a needle stuck in a record. It was August 6th, 1945, just after 8 a.m., and Yamaguchi, an engineer for Mitsubishi, a man thinking more about paperwork and travel plans than history, walked toward the dockyard with a briefcase in one hand and the weight of a long journey home in the other. He was supposed to be leaving the city that very day, a simple departure, a return to Nagasaki. But sometimes history stalks its witnesses, and that morning, it had already marked him. He was less than 2 miles from the epicenter when he heard a sound he would later describe not as a roar, but as the world itself inhaling. A pressure, a tremor, a strange shiver that made him tilt his head upward. At 8:15 a.m., the sun flashed white, not warm, not gentle, a light so violent that for a split second it erased every shadow, every edge, every boundary between the living and the dead. The sky did not brighten, it detonated. Yamaguchi's brain never had time to understand. The blast plucked him off his feet, hurled him like a paper doll across the shipyard, burned the left side of his body, tore his eardrums, and left him screaming into a silence dense with dust and static. He staggered up in a world unrecognizable, glass powdered into glittering dunes, steel curled like wilted petals, human voices rising in thin, stunned whispers. Above him, a towering column of smoke twisted into the heavens like an omen. But this is not a story about dying. This is a story about what happens when survival becomes a terrible, impossible task. One that demands not just luck, but movement, instinct, and the refusal to collapse under the weight of a catastrophe no human mind had words for. Bleeding, half-blind, deaf in one ear, Yamaguchi limped toward an emergency shelter, clutching the tatters of his briefcase as if routine could anchor him in reality. He spent the night in a city without light, without shape, without certainty that morning would ever come. Yet when dawn finally crept across the horizon on August 7th, he rose, wrapped his burned body in bandages, and made a decision as unimaginable as what he had survived. He would return home to Nagasaki. Trains were still running, improbably, groaning through a landscape that looked carved from ash. Yamaguchi boarded one, sinking into a wooden seat alongside passengers whose bandages and burns told stories that needed no words. Smoke rolled across the countryside, villages blurred by haze. But to him, the train felt like a lifeline stretching backward toward normalcy, toward his family, toward a life that had not yet learned the new vocabulary of atomic fire. When he arrived in Nagasaki on the morning of August 8th, his wife did not recognize him at first. His skin was charred, hair singed, clothes stiff with soot, but he was alive. That alone felt miraculous. He went to the hospital. He explained what had happened. Doctors listened, puzzled, skeptical. An entire city destroyed in seconds. A bomb that turned air into flame. They had heard war stories, but not this. Yamaguchi insisted. He described the flash, the blast, the mushroom cloud. His superiors at Mitsubishi called him in the next morning, August 9th, asking him to recount the event so they could understand how Hiroshima had been lost. And so, there he stood in a boardroom, skin blistered, head wrapped in bandages, voice hoarse, trying to explain the impossible to men who shook their heads in disbelief. At 11:02 a.m., while he spoke, the world answered for him. A second sun ignited. He saw it through the window. Another blinding flash, another white sphere swallowing the horizon. And in that split second, Yamaguchi had a thought no human being should ever have. It's happening again. There was no time to shout, no time to dive for cover. The blast slammed into the building like a cosmic hammer, shattering glass, pitching desks into the air, crumpling walls as if they were paper screens. He was thrown backward, the shockwave rattling the bones already battered from Hiroshima. Dust filled his lungs. Plaster fell like snow. The room twisted and folded around him. When consciousness returned, he was lying on the floor in darkness, thinking he must be dead. But death was quiet, and this was chaos. Colleagues groaned in the rubble, flames crackled in distant corridors, and Yamaguchi, somehow, found his way to his feet again. His bandages had been blown off, his wounds reopened, but his legs moved, trembling, stubborn. He staggered out into Nagasaki's burning streets, lungs choking on radioactive dust, skin sizzling from the shock of the blast, and all he could think, over and over, was whether his family was alive. He ran, past collapsed houses, past bodies sprawled like shadows burned into the ground, past children crying for parents who could no longer answer. He reached his neighborhood to find nothing but rubble, smoke, and the skeletal remains of familiar streets. And yet, impossibly, his wife and infant son survived. They had left the house moments before the blast, searching for ointment for his burns. The very injury that marked him as a survivor in Hiroshima had saved the lives of his family in Nagasaki. Trauma had become a shield. Chance had become a guardian. But survival did not end with the flames. Radiation sickness carved through the days that followed. Fever, vomiting, hair falling out in clumps. He drifted in and out of consciousness, trapped between life and death, between the memory of 2 sons and the fear that a third might rise. Doctors had no treatments, no explanations. They could only watch as he hovered on the brink. Yet just as the war sputtered to its violent end, his condition began to stabilize. His burns healed. His strength returned. He lived long enough to witness Japan's surrender, long enough to understand that he had become the only known person to endure 2 atomic bombs and remain alive. Years passed, scars faded but never vanished. Trauma quieted but never softened. His story belonged to the world now, yet he did not seek fame or attention. For decades he spoke little, carrying the memories like coals that still burned but no longer blazed. He worked, he raised his children, he aged, and the world around him marched deeper into the atomic age, building weapons of unimaginable scale while forgetting the faces of those who had seen what one bomb could do. It wasn't until late in his life that Yamaguchi began to tell the story fully, first in interviews, then in testimony, then in powerful words spoken with the clarity of a man who had carried the fire and refused to let it consume him. He described the light, the heat, the sound that seemed to tear the sky open. He described the silence afterward, the eerie emptiness, the terrible symmetry of surviving 2 apocalypses in 3 days. His voice carried the weight of truth, not political argument, but lived memory, a reminder that behind every statistic are bodies, families, mornings that should have been ordinary. He lived to the age of 93 years in a world where many never saw past 20 on those August days. When he died in 2010, reporters wrote headlines about the man who survived 2 atomic bombs. But the truth is quieter and heavier than a headline. He was a father, an engineer, a witness dragged twice into the center of history's most violent experiments. His life was not defined by the bombs. It was defined by everything he did afterward, by the simple, stubborn act of living. And maybe that is the strangest part of his story. Not that he survived once, not that he survived twice, but that after witnessing the end of the world 2 times in 3 days, Tsutomu Yamaguchi stood up, walked forward, held his family close, built a life from ashes, and kept telling the world what he saw when the sky turned white. If his life reveals anything, it's hidden not in the explosions, but in the silence that followed, the silence he carried, the silence he eventually broke, the silence that, even now, echoes like a warning and a memory every time we look up and imagine what would happen if the sky ever turned white again.